Welcome aboard. You're watching The Devil's Advocate. No, I'm not John Caldera. You'll notice that I actually do have a full head of hair and look a lot younger and more attractive. John's going to kill me for that later, but no, this is Ben DeGrow, Senior Education Policy Analyst at the Independence Institute. So glad you could join us for the weekend and the opportunity to have a great discussion about education. Here with me from the American Enterprise Institute, Rick Hess, and the Superintendent of Douglas County Schools, Liz Fagen. Thanks both for joining. The issue of education is one that is at the forefront. Education's a multi-billion-dollar enterprise, thousands of students affected, and yet an issue that often gets overlooked in our schools is the issue of leadership. And Rick Hess is a prolific author with the American Enterprise Institute. You've written a great new book called Cagebusting Leadership. And at the risk of wondering whether the viewers for our show might overlap with those who watch something like the World Wrestling Federation, maybe you can clear up any confusion and say this isn't about cage wrestling, this is about cage busting. Give us a picture of what we're talking about in the world of education. What is a cage busting leader? What does that look like?
Sure. You know, we talk a lot about pedagogy and curriculum and instruction, as we should. I mean, this is the work of teaching and learning. But it's also the case that school leaders, teachers, superintendents work inside these organizations, school districts and schools that are decades, even centuries old in many cases. And one of the challenges for folks trying to do the right thing for kids is that it's not just can you make the best decision about how to use the talent on your staff, the technology at your disposal, the time that's available wisely today, but what happens is school leaders, principals across the country, and superintendents and teachers have to figure out how to do this within rules and regulations that were written in 1975 or 1965, within provisions of contracts that may have been around since the early 1980s. And too often, all of these rules and regulations, contractual provisions and norms wind up creating what I've termed a cage around what leaders and what educators are able to do. So cage-busting leadership doesn't say that we should lessen up one iota on instruction and pedagogy and scope and sequence and the things that matter. But it does say that we need leaders who are able to not just work within the bars, real or imagined, but leaders who are able to remove or replace or elude those bars in order to serve kids best. And this is a book really about what it takes for schools and systems across the country to do that.
So obviously, when it comes down to education, it's about the students, right? We're interested in Colorado, we have a lot of policy debates. It's the world I live in, and we've had, in the last 5 years in Colorado, we've upgraded our academic standards, and we've worked on accountability, and one of the most progressive teacher evaluation reforms in the country here in Colorado. All these things are done by state legislators and state policymakers. How does that, I mean, doesn't that just fix the problem? I mean, how does that affect the leader at the local level?
I mean, it'd be great if these things fixed the problem. Problem is that when we try to fix things in something as personal, as intimate as a schoolhouse or a classroom with policy, we're never going to be able to actually drive down all the way through the kinds of changes that kids need. Policy can, don't get me wrong, policy can make it easier or harder for educators to serve kids well, depending on how we draw that policy. So two things here that you sort of keep in mind. One, these kind of high-level policy solutions come in two flavors. One is an effort to dig out rules and regulations and routines which were put in place 20 years ago or 50 years ago, which might have made sense at one point, but make less sense today. I think those kinds of policy changes are enormously useful, whether that is creating fewer restrictions about who's allowed to teach through licensure, whether that is about creating more opportunity for children to choose the schools that they'll attend, whether that's about removing old rules on teacher tenure and on teacher pay so that districts and schools can make decisions that are going to be in the best interest of their kids. Personally, I think those kinds of policy changes are useful. A lot of the policy we see, though, is another kind, which folks at the state capitol doing the best they can to try to write new rules that they think will make schools work better. Problem is, we've been trying this for decades. And the reality is that some of these things play out, but often even well-intentioned rules wind up not reaching down in the way we'd hope. So for instance, Florida a year or two ago passed an ambitious new teacher evaluation program
Kind of like Colorado's?
Yeah, it's a cousin of the 191, of Senate Bill 191 in Colorado. It's called Senate Bill 736 in Florida. A lot of money, a lot of fuss, a lot of energy. One of the concerns was that 99% of Florida teachers had been rated as effective, and nobody thought that was right.
99% of teachers effective. That can't be right.
Shocking. It seems unlikely. After all of this time, all this money, all this energy and fighting, they got that down to 98%. So one of the things is that even big policy solutions are going to ultimately turn on what folks like Superintendent Fagen and her colleagues and school leaders actually do with those policies. Given that,
and
whether
of course,
or not
those policies, the actual evaluations are things that are happening down at the principal level. We'll go back to some of these rules and regulations, but want to bring it on to Colorado here, Dr. Fagen. You are superintendent of Colorado's third largest school district, Douglas County. People might say, what's the big challenge in a district like Douglas County? Don't you have things under control? You have one of the highest performing school districts in Colorado. What's your response to that?
Well, I've heard that before, and my response is that it's true that we do have a very good school district in Douglas County. We perform very well on standardized measures, and our students do very well. Our parents are very supportive of our school district. It's a great place. But the fact is, the American education system is outdated. It doesn't serve the students for their future. It actually serves them more for the past because it was invented 100 years ago and hasn't really changed all that much. So in Douglas County, we recognize that, and we want to make sure that our students are the best prepared in the world. And so we have to, despite the fact that our test scores are good and people recognize us as a very good school district, even a great school district, we need to maximize the talent that we have and literally reinvent ourselves to create a model for the future of education. And all of these things we're sort of talking about are part of that picture because, you know, in my tenure in various districts, we've always kind of tinkered around the pieces and parts of education, but nobody really goes to the heart of it and really invents it from the bottom up, and that's what we're trying to do.
And I don't think anyone can say that Douglas County's been timid about the way they've tried to innovate and change things. A lot of publicity you guys have received for the Choice Scholarship Program, the voucher program. That's made a lot of the headlines, and some people who are paying attention may have noticed that you no longer have a union, but some of the nuts and bolts work you're talking about here, talk a little bit more about what you're doing and tie that into leadership. How are you guys getting that done?
Well, there's no question that there are certain things that it covered a lot more in the media than others. So scholarship/voucher program, the fact that our union contract expired and we didn't move forward with that, definitely were more headline items than some of the more kind of core work we're doing of literally reimagining the curriculum, what we teach. We rewrote our evaluation instrument and even made it more rigorous than the state one. We have higher standards for our teachers than ever. We've tied that to performance pay. And we're building our own assessment system to actually measure the most important things that our students produce so that we can base that teacher performance on the most important things, not just what's easy to measure. So we've done all of these things. A lot of them don't make the news, but we know at the end of the day, these are the things that our students need and our families want so that, you know, a future workforce from Douglas County is the best prepared anywhere.
So let's bring it back to Rick here. We're talking about Douglas County. They've doing some pretty significant things as far as the way teachers are paid and evaluated and with the curriculum and the way they're testing their students. But looking at that more closely, Douglas County, as we mentioned, has been able to do that without a benefit of a union contract. That's not something that a lot of school district leaders have the benefit of. Is the collective bargaining agreement that most school districts have to operate under, how much of an obstacle really is that to getting things like this done?
So, you know, collective bargaining agreements set rules around what school districts are able to do and not able to do. It's the way the world works. It's certainly in a number of cases, I think that contracts get in the way of leaders making decisions which will best serve kids. There are contract provisions across the country that restrict to the precise minute the length of the school day, the bell schedule, who gets professional development, where teachers can be assigned. I think any number of these things actually make it harder for school leaders and teacher leaders and superintendents to make the right decisions for kids. But it is also true, I think, that the degree to which contracts get in the way of serving kids is enormously exaggerated. That I think school leaders and system leaders can do much more than they tell us they can do. And they choose not to act. In fact, in many cases, I think they hide behind the contract because it is easier to tell us they can't than to actually face the fuss of trying to do it when people don't want to do it, because they don't actually know what's allowed, because a shocking number of system leaders haven't actually read their contract, because they've never seen it done, and so they imagine they're not allowed to do it, or because it's ambiguous. The contract has contradictory language. I remember a St. Louis contract a few years back, which said that the superintendent, teachers will be assigned across schools with first priority being given to teacher seniority. The next paragraph said the superintendent shall have the discretion to assign teachers to schools based on determination of student need. These are not the same thing. But when you talk to folks in that district, they would tell you that they had to go by teacher seniority instead of actually saying, you know what, this is an open question. We're going to fight to do what we think is right for kids. So contracts are a problem, but they are not as severe a problem as we often hear. A huge part of the problem is that we have got a culture of timid and too often irresponsible leadership that uses contracts as an excuse not to serve kids well.
So it's a cultural issue we're hearing. In the case of Douglas County, you guys, up until last year, as you mentioned, you did have a union contract. Are there any specific and tangible ways that you would see that as an obstacle to the kind of reform that's good for students, or is that something you had to work around? Were there things like seniority issues or things dictating how many minutes in the classroom could be used for this, or what kind of obstacles did you face?
Well, I think it's a little known fact that although our contract with AFT expired, we continue forward with a contract with our transportation union, and they are good faith partners with us in doing what is best for students. It's been a good partnership, and there's been no trouble in the water on that, and we continue forward with that. We're in negotiations with them right now. It's going very well. So I think I agree with what Rick said, that having a contract or not is not the issue. It is our leaders willing to put the hard items on the table and say, these are things that we have to have for our students and able to do what we need to do as a school district to best serve these students, to best serve our community, and to just hold the line on that. And if the other side wants to be a good faith partner and work with you on those things, great. And I've had a long experience doing just that with people in other states. Sometimes, though, there comes a time when you have to decide whether you're going to compromise on what you want for kids so everybody gets along and there's smooth sailing ahead, or if you're going to say, no, I'm going to do what's best for students. That's what I'm here for. I know what's best. I've done the research. I understand. And this is a deal breaker. So we're going to have to stay this course, and we'd like you to be part of that. But if you don't want to, we certainly understand. And that was the case in Douglas County. We had over 100 hours of open negotiations where we had 25 items, all good for kids, aligned to 3 specific goals of the district. And we just couldn't get agreement on those critical items that we really felt we needed to have. And so knowing that we absolutely need a model for the future of American education, we know that our teachers have the talent to actually build that. We stayed the course and did the hard thing.
Sounds like a lot of the challenge for educational leaders like you or anyone else is having to make those kinds of tough decisions. And when it comes to tough decisions, you often hear some education leaders come up with the story, well, if we only had more funding to do it, and in Colorado we're often told that Colorado ranks below average in the nation. I hear these arguments a lot. And in your book, you write that school reform, it's not reform if it costs more. Is that really the case?
I think. I mean, if you give somebody 20% more funds, seems to me they need to do 20% better just to have not wasted the money. It's not reform unless they're doing 21% better with 20% more money. So, oftentimes when we talk about successful school models, district charter schools or charter schools, people will get high and mighty and brag about how well they're doing with a model that's relatively expensive. I'm actually not all that impressed if you can do better with more. I'm impressed when people can do better without more. So I think a couple of things kind of come together here real clearly. One is what Liz is pointing out is she's doing what I think too few leaders do, which is just stand by her convictions, try to do what she judges to be right for kids, and Liz is accountable to a school board, who is a school board that will ultimately make decisions about whether she's out serving the kids. Problem is, in getting leaders to feel comfortable making that kind of stand, you need a degree of political courage on the part of school boards in the community. And one of the unfortunate things in Douglas County is how I think many folks who I would typically regard as school reformers have, instead of throwing their support behind the leadership in Douglas County, have seemed to go out of the way to cast aspersions or take shots at the district leadership for doing what they think is right.
What was an example of that? And why do you think that might be the case, that people we would consider reformers are really questioning and criticizing that?
Well, there's an interesting thing around the unions, and I think, we often talk about education as a nonpartisan issue. I'm not actually sure that's right. When Democrats have stood tall to try to fight for, tweaking contracts and modifying regs in ways that I think are good for kids, I think you've actually seen Democrats and Republicans standing side by side. I think you saw a real warm reception for the Obama administration and Secretary Duncan around race to the top. You saw this when Rahm Emanuel stood up to the Chicago teacher strike. But I think the story is actually different when it goes the other way. When Scott Walker put forward a proposal in Wisconsin, Act 10, which would not have abolished unions, and which unions were still free to negotiate for salary and wage-related benefits, he got attacked by Democrats for Ed Reform, who said, you know what, this is an unprovoked, horrible, mean-spirited attack on teachers. They said, look, we don't mind challenging unions, but you go too far. And I think that's what we've seen in Douglas County. I think people who are legitimately reformers, whose hearts are in the right place, somehow when they see Liz, I think, taking the logical step, saying, look, until we can get a deal that actually works for our kids, we'd rather take no deal, rather than patting her on the back and saying, my goodness, we're going to support this because that's the kind of reform we need in suburban communities, they're using it as an opportunity, the same way they used some of these other state-level fights, to kind of show that they actually are on the union side, even if it means throwing a potential reform ally under the bus.
It's
and
truly
I just find
hard
I find it problematic.
Truly hard to separate education from politics. But going back a minute for this issue of funding, just to be clear, all the things we talked about that Douglas County is doing, it's, for those who don't know, you guys are near the bottom. And the state of per pupil revenue.
We're the lowest in the Denver metro area by a significant amount.
And yet you've been able to accomplish and move forward some pretty bold reforms that I think are ahead of pretty much any school district you'll find. How are you guys able to accomplish that without a huge new infusion of cash?
Well, I mean, it's the conversation, what you're going to do, the equally important to that is what you're going to stop doing. And so one of the things I think we've done pretty well is that we have scoured every line of our budget and everything that we do and looked for things that are costly that don't make sense anymore when you look at our new priorities and our values and what we know our kids need for the future. And so,
can you give me one or two examples of something you had to cut out?
Well, I mean, some of these things are very unpopular, but an example is we went through our contract, much like Rick mentioned, and found that we had been on a 4-year pay freeze with our teachers. So teachers who were hired 4 years ago had been frozen, even if it was at $32,000, they'd been there for 4 years. And at the exact same time that was happening, we had teachers who were leaving our system that were getting $40,000 in severance money. And that didn't make a lot of sense to me because the teachers who were staying and going to work with our students that hadn't had a pay increase, and we kept saying, well, we don't have new money, which that was true. We absolutely didn't, and our money was actually shrinking. We were having rescissions from the state, we were having reduced funding from the state, the negative factor. But so while that was happening, it still didn't make sense that these are the people staying with us. They are committed to our students. They're working harder than ever. They're part of this reinvention and rethinking American education, teacher leadership like never before, and we can't give them a pay increase while these people are getting these. I mean, in some cases, these checks are bigger than what these people get a whole year. So we phased that out, and we said, we understand that in good times this may have made sense, but it doesn't make sense to us anymore. And so we're going to take this, and it was over $2.5 million line item. And we're going to take this, and we're going to give a raise. Now, it was a tiny raise, and we wanted way more for our teachers. But every little piece helps. You have to do every little piece in part. You can't just say, well, that's not that much money. Well, that's not that. I mean, at the end of the day, all of those things put together are real money. And so we literally scoured everything to put together a compensation package that I think was one of the best on the Front Range last year, despite the fact we got no additional revenue from the state of Colorado, and we had the lowest per pupil funding we'd had in 3 or 4 years.
So Douglas County cutting out things like paying teachers not to teach or paying union leaders. You don't see this kind of leadership very often, am I wrong? You talk to a lot of education leaders around the nation. How many Liz Fagens are there out there?
Not many. This is hard stuff to do. It's going to roil the waters. You've got to have a real stiff backbone to actually do that stuff. But it seems to me that these are the kinds of tough decisions you need. Here's another example. So Liz pointed out ways to scour and look for money. There's a district I was working with not long ago we sat down and looked at it. Districts use K-12 art and music teachers often to do coverage for other teachers, what they call preps, when teachers get their break period to kind of rest up and get ready for the next class. You can't do that with pre-K in the state I was in because K-12 and pre-K have a different license. And this is pre-K special ed. So they needed particular individuals to sit in these pre-K special ed classrooms. They had 26 pre-K special ed teachers whose job was to drive around the district, sitting in on other people's classrooms. It was fun duty because you got to visit your friends, be in different schools. These were 26, it's hard to find certified pre-K special ed teachers. So as a result, because people wanted this job, they had long-term subs in the actual classrooms in many of these cases. The cost of this, 26 people at about $70,000 a year, was about 1.5 mil. Plus there was travel costs, it was about $1.7 million so that they could give kids lousier teachers than the ones they had driving the cars. Now, you have to actually do this, it means you're going to have to tick off 26 special ed teachers. Other teachers have got their eye. But this is the kind of stuff that if you do it, this kind of money is littered over the landscape. Another place to look, if you've got viewers or parents or whatnot are interested in this stuff, University of Michigan researchers have long reported that only about 70% of instructional time is used for instruction.
And where's the other 30% going?
Assemblies, announcements, field trips, attendance taking, discipline, all this stuff. Which means that if kids are in school for, say, 1,080 instructional hours, which is about 180 days, 6 hours, about 360 hours are wasted. Now, when we talk about extended school days or extended school years, you extend the school year by 2 weeks, which costs a lot of money. 2 weeks only gets you about 50 hours. So if schools can reduce, say, by 15% the wasted time, they can actually get the equivalent of 2 free weeks of instruction. One way to do this, a guy named Doug Lemov wrote a wonderful book a year or two ago called Teach Like a Champion. One of the things he talks about is a bunch of tricks that effective teachers use. One of the ones he talks about is what he calls tight transitions.
Way to save time.
Way to save time. So if you look at a typical K-5 classroom, a teacher will be passing out paper maybe 15 times a day. When you stopwatch it, it typically takes about 2 minutes, minute and a half to 2 minutes, from when the teacher starts passing it out till they're back on task. 15 times about 2 minutes is about 20 to 30 minutes a day. That's about 2 to 2.5, it's about 2 hours a week. That's about 70 hours over the academic year. If you can simply, what he flags teachers who practice passing out paper the first day of school. Kids enjoy it, it's like soccer practice. Kids get it down to 15 seconds, that reclaims you that 50 hours right there. So simply training a class to pass out paper efficiently the first day and sticking with it is like getting 2 free weeks of instruction at the end of the year.
So we're talking about problems that are not just related to the union contract or bureaucracy. They're things that if we have a strong education leader in place that they can do just by changing the culture, it sounds like. So what do we do in the big picture? Maybe I'll pass it over to Liz first. How do we foster more, how do we clone more Liz Fagens? How do we get more education leaders like yourself out there to make these hard, tough choices, to the way we use time and the way we use money and use them to benefit kids? How do we get more people like you?
That's a great question. I don't really think I have the answer to. I think that an important part of a superintendent's success is a supportive board. And I think that sometimes that's not, there's not enough attention paid to the fact that a quality board that is aligned to a certain set of outcomes, that has an accountability system, that has high expectations for a superintendent is an integral part of getting there. But I'm not exactly sure what the recipe is for different types of leadership. Rick's book is definitely a way to free leaders who are current leaders from maybe these paradigms that bind them up that are not really all that confining once they really explore them further. But the courage to actually step out on the limb is something that I'm just not sure everybody has that. Or maybe it's not courage, maybe it's just not interested in causing such a fracas that that you have to live with. And so there's just so many parts and pieces of taking a 100-year-old institution and saying, I know that our test scores are fine and that's all the world's looking at anyway, but we want more. And that's a big, heavy hill that you have to climb. And I'm not sure how you get people passionate toward those ends. There's a group called Ed Leader 21. These are superintendents from across the country, and they seem to have that same desire to move their districts ahead. But I don't know how you create that. I think people just sort of naturally are drawn together that have it.
So you've written the book Cagebusting Leadership. In the last minute or so we have here, how do we clone more Liz Fagens? Or related, how do we take the work of people like that and make sure it's sustainable once they're gone? If it's just the power of a leader and changing the culture, how do we keep that momentum in place?
Sure, I think probably 4 things. 1, we've got to recruit these folks. Too often you go into systems, they keep their head down, they work in the machinery, they don't want to call too much attention. We need to actually identify those guys and encourage them and support them into leadership roles. 2, we need to train for this. The kinds of stuff we're talking about today is usually discouraged in leadership training. Folks are encouraged to focus entirely on collaboration, on stakeholder buy-in. These are good things. But the way they are taught in schools of education and the way they are taught by the gurus to many leaders is essentially boils down to being nice. And being nice means not upsetting people, not cutting things, and that's a problem. 3rd is how we support our leaders. We don't give leaders the kinds of encouragement to do these things. And 4th is what we flag. So for instance, if you are a superintendent and you find cost savings and you make you do the heavy lift to realize them, nobody celebrates you. If you're an associate superintendent and you do that, you rarely get commended, you don't get written about in the papers. On the other hand, if you get test scores to bump up 2 points, people get very excited. So we actually need to value and honor the fact that spending dollars more wisely, that using time more wisely, is a hugely important piece of how do we set up schools to succeed for kids.
Well, I'd like to thank you both for joining me today for this great discussion about education and leadership. Rick Hess from the American Enterprise Institute, Liz Fagen, Superintendent of Douglas County School Districts. Keep up the great work you guys are doing. And in honor of the late Margaret Thatcher, who passed away not long ago, I believe she said consensus is the negation of leadership. Great work in leadership. Thanks for joining us on Devil's Advocate.